ever get that feeling. Like you really want to understand something.
Right.
Like really get to the bottom of it. Go deeper than just, the headlines and all the surface stuff. But then you start digging and it's like, whoa, this is a lot. A mountain of info. It can be kind of overwhelming, right?
It definitely can. And that's exactly why we're here today, right? To take one big idea and really, really dig into it.
Right. And today we're diving deep, deep into grit. This idea that, well, psychologist Angela Duckworth argues is actually one of the biggest, maybe the biggest, predictor of success. Even maybe more than natural talent, which is interesting.
It really is. I mean, Duckworth's done a ton of research, right? And combine that with your own experiences. And it challenges this idea that success is all about what you're, you know, born with or maybe your background. And her book and TED Talk, they've been so popular. I think it shows that people are really looking for new ways to understand achievement. Like maybe it's not all set in stone.
Totally. So today, our mission, our goal here is to equip you with a solid understanding of grit. We're going to unpack what it actually is, why Duckworth believes it's so crucial for, reaching your goals, and most importantly for you, how you might actually develop more of it. We'll draw from examples from all sorts of fields too. Education, high-level performance, all that stuff, just to make it super clear how grit works. Okay, so let's get down to it. What exactly is grit in Duckworth's view?
Well, at its core, Duckworth defines grit as this powerful blend of passion and perseverance. And this is especially important, when we're talking about those big long-term goals. So it's not just about those bursts of energy and effort, getting really fired up about something for a short period of time. It's more about sticking with things, over the long haul. The long game. You could think of passion maybe as your compass, like it gives you direction. It's that thing you're truly interested in and really dedicated to. And then perseverance is that engine. It's that consistent effort, that resilience that keeps you moving forward even when you hit roadblocks or things just get, a little boring.
Okay, so it's more nuanced than just liking something, and it's definitely not just pushing forward no matter what. There's more to it, right?
Yeah, there is. So Duckworth, she breaks down passion into these two key parts. Interest and purpose. And interest, that's pretty straightforward. It's that real curiosity you have, that enjoyment you get from doing what you're doing. It comes naturally, But purpose, that takes it a step further. It's this feeling that your work, it matters. It contributes to something beyond just yourself. And Duckworth, she really emphasizes that this is different from sticking with something because you're scared, right? Like afraid of failing or maybe disappointing someone. True passion, the way she sees it, it comes from that genuine interest and a hopeful outlook.
Okay, that's a really important distinction, this idea of passion versus fear. What about the perseverance side? How does that actually play out?
Right. So perseverance, according to Duckworth, it's all about consistent effort, right? Practicing regularly, learning from your mistakes. But a huge part of this is hope. That belief that if you keep putting in the effort, you're going to get better. Even when you hit those obstacles, it's about having that bounce back ability, to see those setbacks as opportunities to learn instead of reasons to just quit.
Yeah.
And to keep your eyes on those long-term goals, even when things get tough or just plain boring.
And this is where Duckworth's work gets really, really interesting, I think. Because maybe you felt like talent is the only thing that matters, right? But she really challenges that. And some of her own experiences, like when she was teaching middle school math, really highlight this.
Oh, that's such a great example. So she noticed while she was teaching that some students who didn't, immediately get everything, they actually ended up achieving more than the kids who seemed to just grasp things effortlessly. And what she saw was that the students with more grit, the ones who just kept trying, who weren't afraid to ask for help, who didn't get discouraged easily, well, they surpassed those seemingly gifted students. And this really highlights her point, that the abilities you're born with, they're just the starting point. What you actually do with them, how you apply yourself, that's what really determines your success.
And those observations, they actually led to the development of the grit scale, right? This tool to try and measure these qualities of perseverance and passion.
Exactly, yeah. So the grit scale, it's basically a series of questions, right? And they're designed to assess an individual's level of these traits, these characteristics. And what's really fascinating is how well the scores on this scale, how they've correlated with success in all sorts of really demanding situations. We're talking West Point cadets, right? Going through that incredibly tough training. Salespeople dealing with rejection day after day, even high school students, right? Trying to navigate those academic pressures, even the Green Berets, incredibly focused. And those contestants at the Scripps National Spelling Bee, so determined. And in all of these different areas, people who scored higher on the grit scale were more likely to achieve their goals. And Duckworth, she has that famous quote, she said, "Our potential is one thing, what we do with it is quite another." And it really suggests that this self-assessment of qualities like sticking with things actually has a lot of predictive power. Like, it can tell us something about how people will navigate those tough challenges.
Okay, so we're starting to get a good grasp of what grit is. Now let's dig into why Duckworth thinks it's such a game changer. Why does she think it can be more important than just being naturally gifted?
Well, one of her core arguments, and this is really important to understand, is that effort counts twice. What she means is it's not just that effort helps you build a skill, but when you apply that skill, more effort leads to even greater results. It's like a multiplying effect. She talks about the work of sociologist Dan Chambliss, who studied those elite swimmers, the top competitors. And what he found was that beyond any talent they might have had or any initial advantages, it was the sheer amount of consistent, even sometimes really boring practice that set the very best apart. These tiny, persistent efforts, fueled by grit, are what lead to those extraordinary achievements. We often think it's about making those huge leaps forward, but oftentimes it's that steady daily climb.
It's about playing the long game, isn't it? And grit is what keeps you in the game even when you're not seeing those immediate wins.
Exactly, yeah. Grit, at its heart, is about stamina. That commitment to the long-term goal no matter what. Duckworth really emphasizes that there are almost never any shortcuts to true mastery. I mean, think about building a business, perfecting a craft, or taking on some really difficult academic pursuit. They all require consistent, dedicated effort. And you have to be able to stay connected to that overarching goal, even when the day-to-day stuff, even when it's not that exciting. It's about staying in love with that process, even when it's not all glamorous.
Now, there's this age-old debate, right? Nature versus nurture. Where does grit fit into that? I mean, are some of us just born with more grit than others?
That's such a good question. And Duckworth, she explores how both our genes and our experiences come into play. There have been studies with teenage twins in the UK, right, looking at the heritability of both perseverance and passion. And while these studies do show a genetic component, the research actually suggests that a larger portion of the differences we see in grit between people, it's actually shaped by their experiences.
And that's really encouraging, right? Because it suggests that grit isn't something fixed. It's not like you're just born with a certain amount and that's it. It's something that can be developed and strengthened throughout your life, kind of like your height. Your genes play a role in how tall you could potentially be, but things like nutrition and your environment, they have a much bigger impact on how tall you actually become. And it seems like grit follows a similar pattern.
So it's not this fixed quantity. It's more like a muscle you can train. You can actually work to build your grit over time. Yeah, exactly. And Duckworth points to research that shows that a lot of people actually do become grittier as they get older, as they have more experiences. It's not about reaching a certain level of skill or success and then, just coasting. In fact, she argues that complacency, getting too comfortable, is one of the biggest obstacles to developing grit. A truly gritty person, they're always looking for ways to improve no matter how much they've already accomplished. It's that constant striving, that desire to be better.
So, okay, we've got a handle on what grit is. We know why Duckworth thinks it's so important. And really good news, we know it can be developed. So let's get practical. How can we actually start to cultivate more grit within ourselves? Duckworth talks about interest being a starting point, right?
Yes, absolutely. That passion that comes from genuine interest, well, that's the fuel that keeps you going, that keeps you dedicated over the long term. When you're truly engaged with what you're doing, it doesn't feel like a chore, right? It can feel like a calling. And Duckworth, she points out that even though there's a lot of pressure to go for those stable, financially secure careers, research shows that people are generally more satisfied and more motivated when their work aligns with their genuine interests, and they actually perform better as a result. It's kind of like that saying, if you love what you do, you'll never work a day in your life.
That's a nice thought, but finding that deep passion, it's not always easy. Sometimes it takes time. It doesn't just appear overnight.
You're absolutely right. It's not always a sudden revelation. It's more like a journey, a process of discovery. And Duckworth, she gives us some great examples, like Julia Child. She didn't find her passion for cooking until she was in her late 30s. And Mark Vetri, the chef, he was more into music when he was a teenager. So if you haven't found that big passion yet, it's totally fine. Don't stress. The important thing is to stay curious, keep exploring different things, and be open to new interests as they pop up. You never know where they might lead.
Okay, so let's say you have that spark, you have that interest. The next step in building grit, according to Duckworth, is practice. But not just any practice, right? She talks about deliberate practice. So what makes that different?
It's a great question. It's a really important distinction. Gritty people, they're not just going through the motions, right? They're
Mhm.
actively trying to get better at specific things. And that's where this deliberate practice comes in. It means identifying those areas where you need to improve, setting clear goals, challenging goals for getting better, and then focusing your efforts on those areas. You're constantly tracking your progress, you're getting feedback, and then you're adjusting your approach based on that feedback. Duckworth talks about this Japanese concept of kaizen, which is all about this philosophy of continuous improvement. It's about always pushing yourself, never settling for just good enough. And she talks about that famous study of violinists at a German music academy. The ones who achieved the most, they put in way more hours of this focused, deliberate practice than their peers who weren't as accomplished. Even Martha Graham, the amazing choreographer, she famously said it takes about 10 years to become a mature dancer. So it's not just about the quantity, right?
Right.
How much you practice. It's about the quality, the intentionality behind it. Think about learning a new language, right? Instead of just passively listening, deliberate practice would be like focusing on really difficult grammar, then actually using it in conversation, getting feedback, and really, really understanding it.
Okay, so it's focused effort with a clear goal of improvement, not just mindlessly repeating stuff. And then Duckworth talks about how finding a sense of purpose can make that passion even stronger. How does that work?
Right. So purpose, it takes that personal interest, that thing you're passionate about, and connects it to something bigger than yourself. Maybe it's about helping others. Maybe it's a cause you believe in. Duckworth tells this really incredible story about Alex Scott. So Alex, she's battling cancer from a really young age, and she started this lemonade stand to raise money for childhood cancer research. And that purpose, that was so powerful, it fueled her passion, and it led to this incredible impact. And Duckworth also refers to the work of Benjamin Bloom, a psychologist, who studied how talent develops. And he suggests that as people get better in their field, they often move from this self-focused interest to a stage where they find a larger purpose in their work. It's like that parable of the three bricklayers, right? One is just laying bricks, one's building a wall, and the third, well, they believe they're building a cathedral. And that third one, the one with the purpose, they're going to approach their work with so much more passion and perseverance, that feeling that what you're doing matters to others, it can be a really powerful motivator.
That story about Alex Scott, that's really inspiring. It really shows how powerful purpose can be. And finally, the last piece of the puzzle, the last of these internal drivers of grit, is hope. It's more than just, wishful thinking, right?
Absolutely. Hope is essential. Duckworth emphasizes that grit relies on this belief that your efforts will actually make a difference, that you have the power to learn, to grow, to achieve those goals you set for yourself. It's that resilience that the Japanese proverb captures so well, fall 7 times, rise 8. And she contrasts this with people who tend to be more pessimistic, who see setbacks as permanent, like they can't be overcome. Gritty people, they tend to face challenges with a more optimistic attitude. They try to find specific, fixable reasons for those setbacks, and they believe that they can overcome them in the future. And what's really encouraging is that hope, this optimism, it's not necessarily something you're just born with. It can be cultivated. You can learn to be more hopeful through things like cognitive behavior therapy, where you learn to identify and challenge those negative thought patterns and reframe things in a more constructive and hopeful way.
Okay, so we've got these powerful internal tools for growing grit, nurturing our interests, engaging in deliberate practice, connecting to a sense of purpose, and cultivating hope. But Duckworth also explores how our external environment, the people and situations around us, can really influence our grit. This is what she calls grit from the outside in. And let's start with the role of parents.
Yeah, parents, they play a huge role in helping their kids develop grit. Duckworth, she talks about finding that balance between being demanding and being supportive. It's not about being a super strict, tiger parent who pushes their kids without any empathy. But it's also not about being so lenient that kids never face any challenges or learn how to deal with adversity. Gritty parenting means setting high expectations, instilling this belief that your child can persevere through difficult things, while also providing them with love, encouragement, and understanding. She gives the example of Steve Young, the NFL quarterback. His parents, they wouldn't let him quit college when he was struggling, but they were also really supportive of him as a person. The key takeaway is you want to teach your kids that it's okay to struggle. In fact, it's a necessary part of growth, but it's not okay to just give up when things get tough.
And it's not just the home environment that shapes grit. It's also those activities kids get involved in outside of school, right? what Duckworth calls the playing fields of grit.
Exactly. Those structured extracurricular activities like being on sports teams, learning a musical instrument, joining the debate club, or even working on the school newspaper. These things can be really valuable for developing grit. They usually require commitment, over a period of time. They involve consistent practice, and you've got that guidance, that mentorship from adults who aren't your parents. This helps young people explore their interests, learn discipline, feel like they're part of something, part of a team or a group, and they learn how to bounce back from setbacks like losing a game or making mistakes. And research shows that being involved in these activities is actually linked to some positive long-term outcomes. Things like better grades, more success in your career, things like that. Duckworth's advice is pretty simple. As soon as your child is old enough to choose, encourage them to find something that they're genuinely interested in, and then give them the support and encouragement to stick with it, even when it gets challenging.
And finally, Duckworth talks about the power of a culture of grit. How can the people and the environments we surround ourselves with affect our own grit?
This is really fascinating. The norms and values, the expectations of the cultures and groups we belong to, they can have a huge impact on who we become, including how gritty we are. Duckworth, she gives us some compelling examples, like the Seattle Seahawks under coach Pete Carroll. He intentionally built this culture of grit within his team. And institutions like West Point, and KPPQ charter schools, they have cultures that really emphasize perseverance, hard work, resilience, all that. And on a bigger societal level, she talks about this Finnish concept of sisu, which is this idea of extraordinary determination, that ability to endure in the face of adversity. The key takeaway here is being around other gritty people can actually be contagious. When you're a part of a team, an organization, even just a group of friends, where hard work and resilience and commitment are valued, it can really strengthen your own grit. So if you want to develop more grit, seek out those environments. Surround yourself with people who embody those qualities.
So we've covered a lot of ground here, right? We've talked about what grit is, how to foster it in ourselves and in others. But Duckworth also acknowledges that it's not, a perfectly simple concept. There are nuances. There are things to consider.
Right, exactly. So while Duckworth makes this really strong argument for the importance of grit, she does recognize that talent still plays a role, especially in how quickly you can develop skills when you put in the effort. But her main point is that ultimately, long-term achievement depends on consistently applying those skills, and that takes grit. She also stresses that grit isn't the only important character trait. Things like morality, integrity, kindness, those are all essential for a good and ethical life. Grit without those other virtues, well, it could lead down some pretty bad paths.
And she even brings up this idea that maybe there's a point where being too gritty, like stubbornly sticking to a goal that's just not working, could actually be a bad thing.
Yeah, that's definitely something to think about. There are times when persevering with something that's failing just isn't the smartest move. But overall, Duckworth's argument is that most people would benefit from more grit, not less. And she has this great quote that really sums it up. She says, "To be gritty is to fall down 7 times and rise 8. It's that never give up spirit, that resilience that she believes is so important for achieving those meaningful long-term goals."
So bringing it all together, our deep dive into Duckworth's work on grit shows us that achieving our goals, it's not just about talent. It's not just about where you start in life. It's really about developing that passion for those long-term goals and having the perseverance to see them through, even when we face challenges and setbacks. And the really empowering message here is that grit is not a fixed trait. It's something we can actively develop, both through our own efforts and by surrounding ourselves with the right people and the right environments.
And that brings us to a final thought for you to consider. We've spent this time talking about how valuable grit is, how it can help you in so many different areas of your life. But it's important to remember that grit is just one piece of your overall character. So think about this. How might developing even just a little bit more grit in one specific area of your life, maybe it's a tough project at work, a fitness goal, learning a new skill, how might that open up new possibilities? How might it lead to a greater sense of purpose or fulfillment? And how might that increased grit, how might it interact with, even strengthen other important parts of who you are, like your empathy, your curiosity, your sense of fairness?
It's a really great question to think about. And just to emphasize how insightful Duckworth's work is, remember, she's coming at this from a really interesting perspective. She went from this high-pressure career in management consulting to teaching and then to psychology research. So her work on grit is based on both solid science and her real-world observations of people in those high-stakes environments. It makes her conclusions that much more valuable, that much more insightful for all of us.
It definitely does.
And on that note, that's our deep dive into grit. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.